Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in this tutorial series, we are going to dive into an exciting topic of virtual network, VNet in Azure. In that, we'll explore what is virtual network, what happens inside this VNet or virtual network. Then we'll create and configure the subnets in virtual network and many more. So I'll divide this series into two chapters. In chapter 1, I'll explain you the concept of virtual networking, what happens inside the VNet and the key components in VNet like subnet, zones and network security group. And in chapter 2, I'll give you a demonstration where I'll set up the virtual machine. In that, I'll create a VNet step by step. So if you're ready to learn something new, then sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of cloud together. So let's get started.
So let's understand what is VNet or virtual networking in Azure. So let's break it down with very simple example. Imagine there are two companies, company 1 and company 2. Both companies decided to host their application using virtual machines in Azure. Company 1 decided to set up its virtual machine using a virtual network, we call it as a VNet. Similarly, Company 2 also decides to set up his virtual machine using a separate VNet or a virtual network. Both companies want to host their virtual machine with a same Azure region, for example, East Europe. They selected a region they want to deploy their virtual machines in East Europe zone. Within this region, Azure has multiple availability zone, for example, zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3 to provide redundancy and high availability. Let's understand what is virtual network. And imagine company 1 and company 2 both decided to host their application in Azure. Company 1 requests a virtual machine to be set up in East Europe region, specifically in zone 1. Similarly, company 2 also requested a virtual machine in same zone East Europe. Then what cloud provider do? Azure, being a public cloud provider, handles the both scenario. This Azure accepts the both request, both companies request, company 1 and company 2, and handles both the requests. Azure will allocate zone 1 for both companies, but will create, I repeat, but Azure will create a separate virtual network for each company. So company 1 gets its own isolated VNet zone 1 and company 2 is completely separate VNet also in one zone 1. The VNets are independent of each other. Then what happens? The customer related data or resources remain secure or doesn't mix for company 1 and company 2. They have separate. The security of the data is restricted then, or the customer data and resources remain secure, doesn't mix. Each company has full control over its respective VNet and resources. In Azure, the isolated network is called as VNet. So this is all about the VNet, or in AWS we call it as a VPC, virtual private cloud. So let's understand what happens inside the virtual network. So virtual network, what happens in the VNet? So again, let's assume company 1 decided to create a virtual network, we call it as VNet, in East Europe region. Then the first thing that we or the that need to be decided while setting these virtual machines to decide the size of VNet. The first step is to determine the size of VNet, which depends on number of IP addresses required. To allocate IP addresses efficiently, Azure uses this CIDR, which we call it as a classless interdomain routing. For now, think of CIDR is as a method to assign IP addresses range while optimizing routing. Regarding this, just for now, just understand, we just use the default IP address range to set up a CIDR. I will create a separate or I will explain this CIDR in next video. So for now, just understand this CIDR is a method for allocating the routing. Assume company 1 has two applications. One is a web app, and that web app is associated with the database. Then the web app that company 1 wants, the web app should be accessible for users, but the database should not accessible directly to the user. Then this Azure divide the VNet into a smaller logical layer. We called it as a subnet. The subnet 1 hosts the web app, and the subnet 2 hosts the database. Subnets allow you to logically separate and manage resources while staying within the same network or same VNet. Now, company 1 wants user to access only web app which is available in subnet 1. The database in subnet 2 should not be accessible directly to user, only accessible with web app. So, to handling this case, this NSG, we call it as a network security group, is coming to the picture to enforce these rules. To set up a rule, NSGs are used. These are the set of rules that defines with traffic is allocated allowed. The NSG is mostly used to decide the rules. In that, with the help of NSG, we can define the traffic is allowed or denied. So for example, subnet 1, in that subnet 1 we have a web app. So subnet 1 IP is 10.0.0.4 and subnet 2 has IP, private IP is in 10.0.0.2. Then we set a rule, only allow traffic, that is source, from 10.0.0.4 to access 10.0.0.2, which is our database IP address. So now we can restrict, we can set up a rule, and accordingly we can handle the source and destination request. So this is all about the VNet or the virtual network. So this is the background of virtual network, what happens inside this virtual network. Another example, which is a real-time example, and again I will explain you what is virtual network or VNet with a relatable example. So imagine there is a housing society. The housing society, if you see in the screen, it's nothing but, or it represents as a VNet. It's a virtual network. So inside the society there are different wings, and the wing A, wing B, wing C, and so on, wing D. Each wing represents a subnet of that virtual network. Now inside the wing there are multiple flats where people lives. This flat represents resources like virtual machine, database, or web apps, or any other Azure services which is a part of a subnet. So let's assume there is a one housing society. In that housing society there are n number of wings, A, B, C, D. In that, for example, wing A, there are 5 flats. In that 5 flats, for example, those flats we call it as a virtual machine applications, that is database or maybe the web apps or any application. So those flats will stay in one subnet or one wing. So the housing society has main gate. So assume to enter this housing society there is one main gate. The gate acts as a network security group. We call this gate as a network security group, which controls who can enter in the society. For example, inbound traffic, who can enter in the society. Then this entrance gate can also decide who can leave the society, which means outbound traffic. So this is a very quick and simple way of visualizing what is virtual network in Azure. A quick recap what we have covered so far. So in this video we explored what is virtual network. We discussed how a VNet is private isolated network in Azure where resources like virtual machines and database are hosted. Then we see how VNets are defined and work. We saw how VNets are created based on the requirements such as IP addresses allocation using the CIDR, then how public cloud provider ensures a security and isolation when setting up VNets for different customers. Then we see what is subnet, how these subnets are logically divided within the VNet, and we learn how they help organize resources like web app and database. Also, we touch how zones are defined in Azure, how VNet are configured for example, we saw the example company examples for how to configure the companies in the same zone. Then we go on through this housing society example where we explored or we assume the housing society is a virtual network where wings are the subnet of that housing virtual network. Then flats are the virtual machine or databases. The main gate represents the network security group with a control access. So that's all about the virtual network. So that's it. That's this is the all basic idea of the virtual network. What is virtual network or VNet? So now what next? In the next video or chapter 2, I will demonstrate how to set up a virtual network and configure resources step by step. If you found this helpful, please like, share and subscribe to support the channel. Stay tuned for the next chapter. Thank you for watching. Until then, have a wonderful day.